death is the most significant event in the life of a human being. Thus, I have decided to dive deeply into it and understand what death even is. Now, it may seem very simple. Yeah, sure. You would say that it's the end of life. And that's where we begin. That's why we're asking, well, what is life specifically? What is the criterion for calling something alive? How come we can call something alive? What is our definition of that? Now, this series will get much more complex further on. Obviously, we will have to ask about consciousness. Because let's be quite frank, when we think about what death is, we're not really trying to think about what happens to the snail on the road. We're not really trying to think about what happens to the tree. You can kind of biologically, scientifically explain that, sure, but everyone cares what happens to them. Like, we're all so self-centered. It's incredible. But let's start off with the first part of this video. In this video, we'll specifically be taking a look at what even is life to begin with. If we want to understand death, and the very simple definition of death I've found is literally, it says that it's the end of life. Well, then we have to understand, what is this thing? What is this life? What is it that we call life? What's the necessity for something to be called alive? For this, we will be using biology because, well, it's quite literally the study of life. Now, even though this is a philosophy channel, and it's a more supposed to be more philosophical, I don't want to go deeply into science. I'm not that excited by it. First of all, I'm kind of selfish in that it's not that fun, and I like more of the fun. But it's very important to still rely on biology because they have all the information about life. They're the most knowledgeable. It's the art of life, quite literally, and you cannot also argue that it's not philosophical because if you look at Aristotle, for example, he studied life. He even did some kind of sorting of different life forms. He was like the first person to ever do it, and we have to rely on this. So let's start off with the common way of answering the question: why do we actually consider something alive? If we look at a zebra, for example, well, this is a very obvious example. We know that the zebra is alive, right? But like, why? Why? Let's go more into detail because it's very hard to say in like basic words. Once you're out of school, you're not really learning all of this, so this is not that actual. And if someone were to ask me like, why is a zebra alive? Like, I would just say because it's moving. I don't know, bro. What the fuck? Because it's alive. I know it's alive. Yeah, but it's actually much more deep than that. Like, if we want to look at the smaller things, for example, the cells in a human being, well, then, like, how can we consider that this is alive? Is it just alive because it's moving? Well, a fire is moving. So there's some common characteristics of a thing being alive. Usually and very commonly, there are 8 life characteristics being used. I kind of drop them down into 6. There's all of the 8 very commonly used ones. You bump into different varieties of these, but most commonly you will bump into these. I dropped some together. Like, for example, I think the second one and the fifth ones are only supposed to be 2 separate things, but I put them together for simplicity purposes because we don't want to get too deep. We don't want to get too biological. We're just trying to understand what it is that we call something alive. So, first of all, let's start off with response to stimuli. Now, this is a very important, this is a very simple way to begin differentiating between things that are not alive and things that are alive. So, if we look at a zebra and there's a change in light, well, it would react, right? Let's say the sun went somehow, we know that the sun is not rising, right? It's spinning around, or we're spinning around the sun. They're fucking astrologist. Okay, so the earth is spinning around the sun, right? That's what's causing it to do the illusion of the fact that it's rising, right? Unless you believe that the earth is flat, right? But maybe it is, I don't know. uh, I'm thinking about doing a video on that But off topic. Let's go back on topic. So when it comes to the sun, this is a very simple way to showcase that there's this instant reaction. The reason being is that even plants can react to it. That's why I'm using this example. The sun rises from the east. It goes slowly to the west. Now, a zebra would react if someday, somehow, the sun would rise from the west. It would go the opposite way. Think of it this way. Sun rises from the east, it goes like this, but one day it would just go the opposite way. Well, the zebra would notice the change practically immediately. And a plant, this is the first time we get to see that life is not unifiedly same. A plant wouldn't have the same reaction of this like kind of immediate adaptation because it would initially be bended towards the way where the sun is supposed to be rising, and it would have a slower reaction. It would be a more slow chemical. There's no sensing, there's no like physical sensing, no eyes seeing that the sun is rising from a different side. So this is actually called phototropism, and we get to see it in plants. They have this like automated cycle of bending towards where the light is, and they do actually adapt to changes in if the light would rise from a different side. There is a clear sign that plants, according to this first characteristics, they are alive because they have the response to stimuli. Compared to a rock, well, obviously a rock would physically there would be some changes, right? In if there would be more heat, the rock would be more heated up, but the rock isn't actually doing anything. There is no kind of response to any stimuli. It's just rocking. It's just chilling there. Now, one argument is that if you look at a thermostat, well, a thermostat reacts to sun. Thermostat shows more heat. Well, could we then say that a thermostat is alive according to this? And that's the reason why, obviously, it's not alive, but that's the reason why we need more characteristics to more clearly define what is something that we call alive and can actually call alive. So next up, another very commonly used criterion is that you would say that an alive organism has growth and development. So obviously our zebra example, a zebra obviously grows, and thermostat doesn't exactly do that. There can be some development, but it has to be external. And that's the very important part of there's this kind of internalized system that's doing all of the stuff happen. There doesn't necessarily have to be externalized change. The only externalized thing that usually comes to when having something being alive is the material the organism would take for energy. And for example, in this example of growing, if the thing has to grow, it has to take materials from the outside. Or zebra would probably eat the plants over here in order to grow. I'm not even sure if zebras eat plants. Hopefully they do. But there's an exception. What about this magic grow toy? Well, this clearly responds to water, and it responds in the way that it grows. So it's like, that's two of the characteristics. It has it. So is this thing alive? So we need another distinction. The distinction is probably the most important one and a very, very important part of living organisms and living things is that it has metabolism. So what exactly is metabolism? Now, I'm not trying to speak to you like you're a 5-year-old, so please don't get offended. But we need to go really deep and really clear and really understand everything to make sure we know what stuff we're talking about. So you probably know what these things are really, but it's good to think about it more clearly, just like have it more defined and be more sure in this stuff. So metabolism is basically taking energy from your environment, from the outside world, and then you use it for inner usage. Your organism, the cells inside of you, they use it to build, repair, and even just like exist. themselves. They repair you, they build themselves, they repair themselves. It's a very complex system. It's like a whole process in there. It's constantly happening. A ton of your cells inside of you that you are made of, they die and are remade into new cells. They don't exactly mate, they separate. I'm not really sure how the process works, but let's not get into that and make it too complicated. It's just important to understand that a living organism takes things from the outside world, eats them, consumes them in some kind of way. It doesn't even have to be just food, it can be sun, oxygen. Like constantly, me just speaking and breathing in between the sentences, I'm taking in the oxygen from the outside world. I'm always taking in something from my environment. That's why we eat and drink. We need it. And homeostasis is another important requirement for calling something alive. And it's just there's kind of self-regulation. There's kind of this self-regulation of regulating the system working properly. There's supposed to be this ideal state, and we can kind of abuse this as humans since we are able to act more or less with a free will, even though that's debatable, obviously. But we can kind of abuse this biological system. For example, you go to a sauna, your system automatically sweats because it's trying to warn you, like, bro, there's something wrong. There's a lot of heat in here. But we know that in the effect of that, sweating then gets out the unnecessary stuff in your body. I'm not really sure how that works, to be quite frank with you, but I just know that it's a very interesting thing to think about. You know, you have this like stability regulator, and you can kind of abuse the system. It's the same as taking a cold shower. Well, the reason why it wakes you up is that your body, it does this homeostasis thing. That's just all you need to remember. So then we could say, okay, well, maybe a fire is alive. Now, it's important to note that a fire isn't exactly self-regulating. So this is just kind of a very narrow-minded, you have to keep your eyes closed almost exception. But I'm just trying to show that still it can be misunderstood that a fire, it appears self-sustaining. You can kind of maybe think that it's alive. That's why it's important to understand why the not only the metabolism but the self-regulation part is important, because sure, the fire, it takes the energy from the outside, but there's no kind of self-regulation going on. It's just a purely physical reaction that happens. So if we go on, another more clear part of crossing out the fire example, just so we can be completely sure, is reproduction and heredity. Now, we will later learn that the heredity part is more important. What's especially important about it is holding some kind of genetic information. And obviously, a fire doesn't have that. There's no spreading of its genes. Now, you can kind of say that if we get really sci-fi, well, if a robot exists, it can react to stimuli, it can have sensors, it can develop itself through self-modification, which would then be growth, even though it's not happening biologically. That's the important part. We will get to that. That's why we wouldn't really, according to our definition, be able to call it alive. It can metabolize, charging, taking energy from the outside and using it to repair for inner stability. So there can theoretically be sensors self-regulating itself. Theoretically, it can even reproduce and hold the genetic information. That would be its memory. It would give a copy of its memory data, etc., to the copy it makes. So, can we call a robot alive? Well, it's important to say that another requirement that's commonly used is evolutionary adaptation. So basically, what this means is that the common requirements, or the necessary requirements for evolution, are that you have some kind of variation of the species. They behold this genetic information, so there's this heredity. And some of them survive, some don't. Now, an example that's right in front of us is a zebra. Zebras, they look different back then, but the ones with stripes eventually survived more and more and more until the ones with stripes stayed. Now, it's not that this was intentional, it's just that the ones with a bit more stripes tended to survive, and eventually you have this kind of variation, and it kept cropping to getting more specific and more specific. It's the same with cacti. Cacti actually originally had leaves, but some had smaller leaves. And eventually, those with smaller leaves would survive more because they would save water. They wouldn't have to use that much water. And since it was getting smaller and smaller, eventually they evolved into having thorns, which are amazing because a cactus holds water beneath it, and these thorns, they save it from attacks of predators that want to steal their water. That's why you need to have this variation, because that's how things evolve. If there wouldn't be no variation and no differential survival, that there wouldn't be then no evolution. But is this necessary for calling something alive? Theoretically, a robot could have that. It's possible, but is it even necessary? Well, we will see later on in the presentation. But lastly, the very important part of calling something alive is cellular organization. The thing being made out of cell and having some kind of hierarchy or organization of these processes. Now, that's where we cut the line with the robot. Obviously, a robot cannot have cellular organization. Well, maybe. It's very, very sci-fi, but if you think about it, maybe in the future. And now that I think about it, I completely missed this part when making this presentation. Maybe if we just like put cells into a robot. Like, I've already seen there have been some experiments of teaching neurons in the brain to play Doom. So this is getting very sci-fi, but now that I think about the robot example, maybe we're not that far from being able to call a robot alive, at least on the lower scale of life, but we'll get into it. What's important here is that cellular organization is made of cells. Cell is the smallest living thing. That's why it's important to living things. It's like all of these living things are made of cells. I also wanted to show that a fly is made of 5 million cells and an elephant is made of over 100 trillion cells. In case you're watching, this is what the number 100 trillion looks like. And in case you're listening, this is the banknote that was once in Zimbabwe of $100 trillion. And guess what? This is not fake. This is genuinely true. Motherfuckers in there fucked up the inflation so much they had to make a banknote of $100 trillion, which is insane. I'm not surprised of someone that doesn't even have a president on their cash. They have a bunch of stones. That's insane. But back to the point. Cellular organization. So we talk about this. So organisms, they're built from cells, and robot, well, there's the very clear distinctions. They're not built from cells. They're built from components and data. That's the most simple example of why we cannot call them alive. Why a cell specifically? Why do we call a cell alive and not something smaller than that? Because you have smaller things. You have an atom, you have a mitochondrion that's inside the cell. Why are not those things alive? Well, a cell has all the previous characteristics. It has an inner structure and it has a membrane, and it can function as an independent unit. Now, it's very important to note that it's not completely independent, and we will get to that, and we get the kind of interesting paradox almost. It's a very interesting thing to really think about, but all you need to know is that smaller things, they do not have these qualities. Pretty much all you need to know. So let's go on with this presentation into an important part. You can actually find this on the internet. on NASA's official website if you search about life dissection. And what's important here is that NASA states their commonly used definition of life. It's that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. So self-sustaining chemical system, and it can do Darwinian evolution. So those are three very clear things. Now, this is a very commonly used definition, and the reason why this is important. Why is this important out of all the definitions? Because you can see this is very different from stating the 8 characteristics we've done. The reason why this definition is so important is that it's fucking NASA. Like, for these guys, it is so important to correctly define what life is, because they are looking for life on different planets. Now, in the second part of this series, the second episode of this series, we will be looking at why life even begins to exist. So we will jump back on the topic of looking for life on different planets, and we will understand more deeply what's the requirement for life to even exist. But for now, we need to really understand that there is a definition of what life is. Is this a good definition? Is this an accurate one? Well, we will see. Because now we get to look at some borderline cases of life, and these will kind of break our view on things. So let's start off with a virus. Now, this is a very argued thing that I personally do not think is alive, but it just shows like just how borderline is it. Like, a lot of people say that it's a borderline case of life. So what's very important here? So we've defined that we need those characteristics to call something alive, traditionally, right? At least. A virus doesn't have that. It doesn't have metabolism. It doesn't have cellular structure. It cannot reproduce on its own. But it has genetic information, and it adapts through evolution. In case you're wondering, how does it adapt through evolution? How does it happen? Because it cannot reproduce. Well, first of all, I just want to show you proof of a virus adapting. It's literally the most common example I could think of, is that COVID adapted so many fucking times. Look at this shit. Like, in 2019, there was one COVID. In January 2020, there was a second one. In September 2020, there was already a next COVID called Alpha. Like, then you had Beta in November 2020. It's like a month after the last one. Then not even another month after it, you had Gamma. Like, it was adapting so fucking fast. Now, what's important is that there's proof that the virus adapts. But how does it happen, right? Because we say that it cannot reproduce. Well, where does a virus come from? Well, just like a PC virus, a virus comes externally from coughing. So it doesn't really build in your body, or at least that's how I understand it. But the exact origin is debated, right? But all you need to know now is that it comes externally from someone coughing at you. I don't fucking know where the first virus begins, though. So we will look at that more in the next part of this video, in the second episode, where we talk about the beginnings of life. But when a virus comes to you, it comes from someone else externally. I guess it just spreads from everyone. But who gets the first virus? I don't know. This will be more discussed in the second episode, so don't worry about that. What you need to worry about is this analogy I've done. And this will help us understand a process that's called parasitic reproduction. Now, the way that viruses reproduce is that they hold genetic information, they go into a cell in your body, and they tell that cell, okay, make more of me. Well, they give it that information, and they use the cell's everything. They use the cell's metabolism, they use the cell's energy, everything. They just give it that genetic information, and they change its instructions. Let's look at an analogy with a woman, which is clearly alive. She has the ability to reproduce, and some kind of alien virus infects her body. It gives her body genetic instructions that she will now produce more of the virus itself. Do we then get to call this virus alive? It seems that you would, but if it's just using everything from the woman, it's not really life itself, is it? It's a very complicated question. It's very important to understand the process of how parasitic reproduction works. That's why we get to look at bacteria, which do the same thing. They actually, just like viruses, use the cell's environment, but the very clear distinction is that they do it differently. They actually do it themselves. They do the reproductions themselves. At least that's how I understand it. But they just use the environment because it's better for them. But, I thought that they would be able to do it without the cell. It would just be a more ideal environment for them to do it because there's better energy and better environment. That's just how I understood it. But apparently that's not the case. They cannot reproduce without the cell either. They really just genuinely need that environment. So it's a very clear line. You get to see in this that, hold up, this is almost the same thing, bro. Like, how do we get to call one of these? Because normally virus is not considered alive. At least it's considered borderline life. But bacteria, yeah, that's normally considered alive. So you get to see how narrow this line of life just is. And we get to go in at the smallest level possible. Now, next up, the reason why I said that evolutionary adaptation, we will see that it's not that simple. Well, if you look at a mule happens from a horse and a donkey having sex. But most mules, literally 99% of them, are sterile. They're not able to have kids. Therefore, they wouldn't even be able to evolve. They cannot reproduce. Now, does that mean they're not alive? Just like my cat. She is a product of evolution, yeah, sure. But she's sterilized. She's not able to reproduce. She's not able to do more of evolution. Therefore, can we then say that she's not alive? Obviously, when looking at evolution, we're looking at the organism scale. But when looking at mules, not even on the organism scale are they able to reproduce, because they cannot even reproduce with themselves. Now, the reason why this happens is that genetically, when organisms reproduce, they need two organisms holding even number genetic codes. Now, I'm not really sure how that works. I'm not trying to pretend that I do. I'm just saying what I read on the internet. And apparently mules don't have that. They have odd number genetic codes. What the fuck does that mean? I don't even know. But that's apparently the reason. If some of you understand that, hopefully that made more sense. I don't know. So that's very interesting. According to those characteristics, we would then have to call mules not alive. So you see, it's not that simple. It's not that simple at all. And another case of this actually is an organism called tardigrade, or this happens with plant seeds, for example. It's more known to us, like seeds of plants, yeah, sure. Well, it's a process called cryptobiosis. Now, with this example, this doesn't really go against the definitions because there's still metabolism going on. But the important part is that you get to see that life, first of all, is a process, and it's a scale. It's like, it's never that something is dead, something is alive, just like a person being in a coma. Something is more dead, more alive. It's very scalable. Also, the complexity of organisms. So what cryptobiosis is that? The way I understood it is that there's this organism, a tardigrade, that's surrounded by water, and when it's in no oxygen, no water, extreme heat, extreme radiation, extreme cold, extreme whatever, it shrivels into a smaller form called tan, and it basically becomes, an almost dead organism. Like, there's basically no metabolism going on. It's just chilling. It can survive it can like practically turn off for like 100 years, then just go back to normal. Throughout some water, it revets and goes back to its normal form. This is incredible. And you get to see that life is a scale. It's a scale because even on the complexity part, this is pretty fucking complex, but still, an elephant is much more complex. All of the processes happening in an elephant are harder to track because this process could be happening in elephant's balls in some kind of cell that's inside of him. It probably doesn't, but it's just an example I'm making. And lastly, if we take the NASA life definition of a self-sustaining, that's why I said it's important to really look at the details of the words. If you look at a human cell, well, a human cell, like, can you really call that self-sustaining? Like, when I imagine self-sustaining, I imagine that it can just exist by itself no matter what. But, like, the organism, it always gathers materials for cells. It's kind of this mutual contract going on. The organism, it eats, it gets the material for the cells. It's not even, like, a mutual agreement, to be honest. Like, I never really agreed to that. I'm just kind of doing that because like, my body tells me. So I guess my body needs it, so okay. But I guess, yeah, I don't really even know to really think about that. There's no mutual agreement. I'm just like forced to do that, but it makes sense, to be honest. I have this body for that. But back to the topic. The organism, it always gets materials for cells, and the cell requires that. Sure, it produces and repairs the organism, but when an organism dies, when a human dies, most of its cells shortly after die with it. Sure, okay, some cells can outlive the organism. I'm not saying that. For example, neurons in the brain survive like 48 hours after the person dies. Okay, but they still die. That's not self-sustaining. Not exactly. That's not what I would call self-sustaining. So a cell is definitely not metabolically autonomous. Like you when you think of a cell that would be self-sustaining, you would then think that cells just like kind of spread into nature and survive wherever. That doesn't really happen. No, they can survive in like perfect lab conditions where you need a ton of shit to give them. But like in order to call life self-sustaining, like you would then have to say that a human cell is not alive. That would be breaking the definition of one of the characteristics we had when we said that human things have cellular structure, because cell is the smallest living thing. Well, that would just break the whole thing apart, and that would just get much more complicated. So let's look at some alternate life definitions, and this is where, if you weren't listening that much, you really should listen now. This is where things get very important. Starting off with autopoiesis. We need to explain this. This is a very, very good definition of life. I really like this one, and then we will just skip on to some other ways you could define life, and let's see what we get out of it. So autopoiesis is this theory made by this I think it was like a Colombian biochemist, and he was also a philosopher. I'm not sure what nationality he was, but his name was Humberto Maturana, and rest in peace. He died not so long ago, I think. This guy, he proposed that, well, he put these two words together, auto meaning self, poiesis meaning creation, it's from Greek, and it means self-producing or self-creating systems. What this means is that there are these systems that are closed for organization, their organization is happening inside, they're open for material, they take material from the outside world, and inside, they use this material and they can self-produce themselves, they can self-maintain themselves, and they can self-regulate. This was, in short, much more complex than that, obviously, but in short, this summarized what his definition, alternate definition of life is. Now, this is a very great definition, in my opinion. Some other life definitions here are, if we look at NASA, that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. We've already said that. Then we have the autopoietic definition, which would then say that life is a system capable of producing and maintaining itself. Then we can prioritize metabolism and say that life is a system that maintains itself through metabolism. And lastly, the heredity definition would be life is a system that stores and processes heritable information. So you can always see they're always kind of prioritizing different things. It's important to include everything, but there are some parallels in here. You see that a lot of definitions, they get to call life a system. I don't really like that because it seems kind of robotic. It's like a system. When you say a system, I imagine a software in my PC. So what do we get out of this? What do we have to break? So I think what we have learned are some things that we need to change when approaching what life is. And this is so important for us going on with this series about death, because we will understand much more what we're even talking about when we're talking about life. So, first of all, put away the idea that something is self-sustaining. It's self-maintaining. That's what I would call it more accurately. Things they cannot really sustain themselves by themselves. They need the environment. They always use their environment, and everything is kind of reliant upon each other. It's all interconnected, and they can just self-maintain themselves. So it's not happening by itself, it's using its environment. Another thing is that looking at reproduction heredity, what's more important than that is just it's holding some kind of genetic information that it isn't alone enough for it to be alive, but it's more than the reproduction, because we know that mules, they cannot reproduce, and but they still have the genetic information. That's what they have. And then we need to destroy the binary look of calling things either alive or dead. Sure, but it's not that simple. Something is more alive, something is more dead. It's more of a scale. Think of it as hot and cold. Yeah, sure, there's a point of where you get to call it hot. There's a point of where you get to call it cold, but something can be more hot, something can be less hot. So it's a scale, it's more of a spectrum, right? And another binary look that we have to put away, definitely, is aliveness and death. Now, the way I mean this is that my cat is licking my feet, Jesus. Okay, so the way I mean this thing is that you only see the thing outside that is there. Is the zebra, is the human, it's an organism, but it's not really just pure aliveness, like momentary right now. It's a whole ass process. And you even see that with consciousness. Consciousness is a process as well. It's kind of flowing and it's always happening, and these ideas in your head, it's it's very complex to describe consciousness. We will be discussing consciousness, don't worry, but we just need to understand that life is a scale or spectrum of processes, kind of this hierarchy of a lot of different processes happening in an organism, and even the cell itself, the smallest living thing, there are a bunch of processes happening all the time. And lastly, life is not purely physical, and it's self-regulating. It's always regulating itself. It's got this homeostasis thing that we talk about. It's always trying to stay at the optimal. Okay, so if we use all of this knowledge, we get a very beautiful definition of life that I think is so much better. It's got everything in it that we've learned, and it's so much better. So definition is that life is a spectrum of self-regulating processes that use their environment's energy for self-maintenance and carry genetic information. If you look at the important parts of this definition, is that first of all is that life is a spectrum. It's a scale of complexity, a scale of aliveness. Next up, self-regulating processes. A whole bunch of processes in the system. Sounds so weird. This system, I don't really like that. It's a bunch of processes that regulate themselves, and they use their environment's energy. That's putting away the self-sustaining part. No, you always use energy from the environment in one way or another, and they use it for self-maintenance to maintain themselves, keep up with themselves. I didn't really want to say self-preserve. Self-maintains just sounded more accurate to me from way I've read about organisms and stuff. It seems more that they maintain themselves than preserve, because preserve would then imply some kind of always necessity of doing it for survival. But like organisms don't really do that. They more or less maintain themselves for prolonged survival, but the goal is not always to live the longest. It's usually more to maintain either the individual organism or the hierarchy. That's also the part of the spectrum. That's why I say spectrum. Spectrum as a scale, not only looking at the aliveness part, but also looking at the hierarchy of living things. We will learn that, and they carry genetic information. Okay, so this is our alternate definition of life. I hope you have learned something in here. What's next in this series? Well, I kind of have a clear path that I want to go with. We started with today's episode talking about what is life. We more or less understand much better that life is something that's very, very interesting. You know, at least now know how to define life. The scale of processes that self-regulate and they use their environment's energy to self-maintain themselves, and they carry some kind of genetic information. Okay, cool. So what's next for us? We now know that there's this kind of spectrum that I've implied so many times. So in the next episode, we will be looking at what the spectrum exactly is. There's a whole bunch of these. Will be very interesting. I'm very excited to do my research on this. Now, the third episode, if we now understand that, we will have to understand how life even begins to exist. Why is there life? And then, only then, we will be able to talk about what is death. So we will then understand what death is, what the death of life is, what the end of life is. What does it mean for life to end? But then, why? Why is death? Why is there such a thing? That will be the fifth part of the series, a very exciting episode. Be very, very well done, and I'm really excited for that. Next up, we will see how to approach death, because we know that we get to consciously approach it and think about it. But then we get to the question of understanding consciousness, because that's honestly what we're talking about here. And lastly, immortality, life after death. If we understand what consciousness is, we will be talking about the grand finale, the death of consciousness, how to approach immortality. So, hopefully, you're excited for the series just as much as I am. Hopefully, you have learned something. So, see you next time.